Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming and for everybody who's tuning in from the future on the recording. Thank you so much for watching. We're joined here today by a very special guest, Lesley Bannatyne, who happens to be an HES alum, who also happens to be an award-winning short story writer, who also happens to be an actress, and she's in a drum circle, and she's just a phenomenal person who does so many different things. But I think I will let her introduce herself to you because I don't think I could do her justice. I'll post a short bio in the chat, but Lesley, if you could give us a brief introduction of who you are, what you do, and what you like to write, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, first of all, for having me here and for coming to hear this. I love to talk to other writers because it can be kind of something you do all by yourself. And so the opportunity to talk to other people who are doing what you're doing is a real treat. I have been writing since since I was a child. I have written all sorts of things, from advertising to fashion show copy to writing for the newspapers and magazines. For a while, I even wrote an advice column for Morris the cat. You remember the cranky cat that sells cat foods and has a love advice column. I wrote that. I have written obituaries. I have written song lyrics. I have written many things and always, but almost 35 years ago, I started to write books, and I've written 5 books, mostly on Halloween. And out of those books, many articles on folklore and popular culture and mythology. And so I have, most of those have been nonfiction, and most of my work had been nonfiction up to 11 years ago, when I walked into a Harvard Extension School class that was short stories for beginners, beginning short stories. And I thought, well, let's try this. This is fun. I'd taken a lot of extension classes. I love them. And so I walked in, and it was a room full of brilliant young people with tons of wonderful ideas. And I thought, oh my God, what am I doing here? What am I going to do? Well, I fell off the cliff with the first assignment, which is, write a short story. And I thought, okay, what? You mean you can make this up? You don't have to footnote it. You don't have to cite 3 references. You don't have to find a source and get quotes and have pages and pages of addendums and imagine in your mind while you're writing, who's going to object to this? Who's going to disagree with it? How can I shut that off at the pass? It was like opening up a room that you never knew was in your house. And it was the most wonderful thing. And I have been writing short fiction ever since then. So I had a lot of writing background, but not creative writing background. And it was like falling down a rabbit hole. It was absolutely freeing. So that's kind of who I am.
Thank you. That was a lovely summary. I'd like to stay with that for a moment and just sort of talk about your background in nonfiction, switching to the fiction, and how that all transpired. What differences would you say come from coming from like a journalistic analytical background where you do have to have this one perspective because this is the truth, this is the fact. How did you grapple with that, and how did you allow yourself to open up? Because I assume it was a little scary to be able to just kind of take the training wheels off and go.
That is true. The closest I'd come to that was what you would call creative nonfiction. I had the last Halloween book I wrote was called Halloween Nation: Behind the Scenes of America's Fright Night. And I'd spent 2 or 3 years traveling around talking to people who were in love with Halloween and made Halloween stuff. The people that create the zombies and the haunted houses and the ghost tours and witches' covens and everything that I could get to put into this book. Like, what is this holiday and what makes it so special to so many people? I wrote that book experientially. Like, this is my experience of this culture, this is my experience, this is my interview, this is what I think about it. And for the first time, I used the word I in something that I had written. And it was like, it was terrifying. You're right. It was terrifying because it was what I think. And in another way, it wasn't because it wasn't something I had to prove. I didn't have to get 3 people to agree with me that, you can create fake blood out of cornstarch and red dye. So it was both frightening and freeing because I could put my own thoughts in there, and I found that people responded positively. And so when it came time to do fiction, and you're just completely out there, and you're not really, I mean, you've got characters, it's not you out there. You're speaking through characters, and it was a wonderful way to open up all different parts of my life for scrutiny, for investigation, to press them into service. And it wasn't actually frightening at all. Once I did it, it was not at all frightening. It was amazingly freeing. Although I will say that the first stories that I wrote always had a supernatural element. And I think, it was kind of like going down the slide. It's like I had spent so much time with things that were out there that they were like as normal to me as cabbages and cats. So of course they would appear in my first stories as I was kind of ramping up and getting my writing mojo going. I used the things that were very familiar to me.
So I've always wanted to ask you, where did it start with the Halloween, study? Like, where did your interest in Halloween start? When did it start? How old were you? I mean, it's my favorite holiday. I think it's a lot of people's favorite holiday, but how did you become the quintessential Halloween scholar? And, what was that journey like?
It had some very pedestrian beginnings. I love Halloween. I've always loved Halloween, but I love Christmas too. But a friend of mine was a literary agent, and she said, Facts on File, which is a New York publishing house, is looking for proposals about the genesis of American holidays. And I bet if you wrote a proposal, I could sell it. And so it was really a business thing. I had never written a book. I didn't know what it was to write a book. I didn't know all that much about the history of Halloween, but I thought, how hard can it be? I've written articles. I've written newspaper articles and magazine articles. I've written about dendrochronology. If I can write about tree ring science, I can write about Halloween. So there were 2 holidays left, Election Day and Halloween. I chose Halloween. I spent a good 3 years doing research for it, because as it turns out, writing a book is much more difficult than I imagined. And I would write it once and send it off like ching, things are working out for me. And it would come back and say, I had wonderful editors down there. They would say, it's just not flowing. It's just not all there. Maybe think about it, try again. Okay, do it, try again, send it off. It comes back. I send it off again. This time the editor comes back. She flies to Boston. She sits me down in a restaurant. She says, the best thing ever. She says, give it a rest. Let it go. Sit on it for 6 months or 9 months. Don't even think about it. Don't do any research. Don't do anything. Just stop. And then go back and see what you can do. And of course, as writers, this. If you let something go for a bit, when you come back to it with fresh eyes, you've got it. So that time I went back, I went, oh, okay, no wonder. And so I did it again, and off it went. And this time it was published. And that was kind of like going down the rabbit hole. It was interesting. Halloween was interesting. It was more than costumes and candy and kids. It was religion and spirituality and church history and popular culture and immigrants to our country and their folkways and how it all went together to form this thing that we celebrate today. And then it started changing while I was writing about it. So another book and another book and another book happened.
And they're amazing books. So if you don't have those, I definitely do recommend getting them. So that's really cool. So your experience with the editorial process began with the nonfiction, and you sort of started thinking about the craft behind writing with that nonfiction. Could you talk a little bit more about the editorial process and kind of how all that went? Did you have a specific relationship with particular editors? Like, did you work with one editor, or did you write one book with one editor, move on, it was a different book with a different editor? How did all that work?
The first editor I got was brilliant. And she was the one who flew up to Boston and told me, this is what you got to do. And then she left and took a job in public service, creating public housing in New Haven. Okay. Then I got another editor, and that one was not so tied into the project. So I didn't know him so well. And actually, the things that he did do made the book a little bit worse, not better. So that was interesting. But then the book came out, and if you've had anything published, article, book, short story, anything, you know that the first time you open it after it comes and it's a real book and it's a thing in your hands, you're holding your breath because you know there's something in there that's not going to be right. And you just don't want it to be on the first page. But, so it's hard to read that book once it's published because, yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Wait a minute. Really? Oh, no. So those things happen. They're tiny. Most people will never notice them, but you know them because you wrote it and you understand. As time went on, I met other editors, and these are like mostly magazine editors of fiction magazines, literary magazines. When I would get a short story published in the literary magazines, those editors are just wonderful. And because they're not maybe as crazy as a New York publishing house editor. So they've got the piece, they've decided they're going to print this. So they're on your side. They definitely want you to have the best possible piece. And they go through it really carefully. So the suggestions that I have always gotten from literary magazine editors have only improved the story. And it's been a wonderful relationship. They're supportive, they're generous, and they're usually right, no matter what your first reaction is, which is usually like, oh, no. They are usually right. And in fact, I had a story that I was sending out that later became Waiting for Ivy, which is in Unaccustomed to Grace. And I'd been sending that story out, and it had gotten a lot of no's. And then I had a feeling there was something a little bit wrong with it, but I kept sending it out. I really love the story. I still love the story. And finally, one editor from Zone 3, a literary magazine, wrote back, and he said, I really like this story. I'd like to publish it, but you have a problem halfway down on page 8. And I thought, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I looked and I knew exactly what he meant. And I knew that that was exactly where I was getting tangled up myself in what was going on. And so when I straightened that out, and he took it, and that was the version that pretty much appeared in the book. And then the book's editor, again, a short story collection. He's read all of the stories. He was instrumental in suggesting orders. He was great when I wanted to change things, like take stories out or put other stories in. He would say, no, you don't want to take that out. You want to leave that one in. And he was wonderful in that I would really like this story to be in the book. Can we put it in? I know it wasn't in the original manuscript, but can I put it in? And yes was the answer. So totally on your side. I found in all creative fiction, the editors were totally on your side and supportive and helpful. And then in the big New York publishing house, it was depending on which editor you got.
So a lot of that comes down to luck then. You hope you get somebody who's on your side at the bigger publishing houses.
Yes.
So staying with coming back to fiction from your nonfiction journey, you were talking about how it's different because you get to work with characters. Is that how your ideas start? And where is the idea genesis for a story? Do you just kind of notice a person and you notice their mannerisms and then you just vicariously imagine yourself doing these things, or as an actress, do you imagine yourself as that person? What's your process?
Those are great questions. And where to get ideas? I'll go there first. When you start thinking of yourself, when I started thinking of myself as a writer of fiction, it's like the world turns on. And so most encounters that you have are potential for fiction. So, for example, I have a story in the book that's called On Tuesday, I Will Kill Him. And that is because a woman who was close to 80 years old sat down next to me on a couch at a party and said, my grandson was murdered. And the murderer went to jail. And when he gets out of jail, I'm going to kill him. And I thought, okay, now I don't know what she did. I don't know her. I met her once, but I was never able to forget that one and that brief, like 3 sentences that we shared. And so that became for me the story On Tuesday, I Will Kill Him, which is about an 80-year-old woman who loses a grandson and thinks she's going to kill this kid that killed her grandson in a stupid fraternity house accident. And what it's like to be her, which leads me to your second question, which is how do you get inside these characters, and is it like theater? Absolutely, it's like theater. And theater and actors and writers are concerned about the same things. And it's a combination of improvisation and details. I was lucky to be able to direct several theater productions, and to a single person, every single actor I ever directed has always asked at some point or other, what am I wearing? And so it's the same instinct. An actor wants to know what clothes they're wearing, to tell what kind of person they are, it gives them clues, it gives them the details to flesh out their characters. And as a writer, you're doing the same thing. You're looking for those specific details to that person that makes them unique in the world. You know, the limp, the bow tie, the cuffs are frayed, the way they smell. These are all things an actor would be interested in and a writer would be interested in. And then once you have this body that is a character, you can kind of, as a writer, go inside it and figure out how he or she moves or acts or speaks. But like actors, the really good information comes from improvisation. You don't really know what your character is until you're in a scene with another character, because you're reflected back from somebody else. And I always think of writing also as improvisation, especially in the creative part, because you're sitting down, you're at your keyboard. I do a lot of improvisation. I don't know where it's going. I have an idea to start and I just start typing and I keep typing until something happens. And that's really the process of acting too. You're trying things until something happens. And you know when it happens because that's where the energy is. And you always write to the energy, and you're always performing to the energy, acting to where the energy is, finding that specific thing. So improvisation and details are what combine in both writing and theater to make something come alive. And that's what you want. It has to live. Samantha Hunt is a writer of short stories, and she says she knows when she's got something in a story when it goes airborne. And I know exactly what she means, don't you? It's like you have this feeling like, okay, I got something, here we go, here we go. And then it's a matter of chasing it down and following it and developing it.
I love that answer. There's so many things that you said that industry terms for both writing and theater just completely line up. You know, you've got the specificity, the improvisation, the feeling of it living, the thing just coming alive in you, finding the truth. All of those things completely line up. So I very much agree. Um, I'd love to know more about how you plan out the structure of your stories. So earlier we were talking about the patron saint of bachelors and toothaches. And I remember you were telling me about how you structured that so that each cut to whoever was speaking would be a little bit shorter each time so that the characters were kind of circling each other like wild wolves. And that's explanation has really stuck with me because the feeling was there. You made it live on the page. Can you talk about instances where you've done things like that, or maybe that specific instance, what inspired you to do something like that? It was amazing.
Yes. Now I wanted to, with the patron saint of bachelors and toothaches, I wanted to write a love story. So many of the stories I had written had people with incredible challenges, and I just wanted something with a lot of love in it. And so I figure, there's two major ways love stories go. It's Romeo and Juliet, and they're coming together, or it's When Harry Met Sally, and you know they don't realize that they're right for each other until the end of the movie, so they're just traveling together like this. So I decided to do the Romeo and Juliet version, which is start your characters way far apart. They don't know each other, but they really need each other. And I put it in the first person so that the reader didn't know any more than the character did. So one character, Suzanne, desperately wants to find a guy to have a baby with. She desperately wants somebody. And she's done everything she can. She's a tarot reader. She's done everything she can to make this, to manifest this in her life. And Jack, he's kind of like he's not going much. He's going nowhere. He's kind of spinning his wheels, but what he would like is a change. He has a large Irish Catholic family that demands a lot of him, and he wants a little something different. So they start off wanting different things, but what they really want is each other. And I loved, as you know, dealing with animals in this because Suzanne is definitely an alpha wolf. And as they come closer, so you find out who they are, but how do they get closer to each other? The closeness I could do by shortening the Jack, Suzanne, Jack, Suzanne, Jack, Suzanne. So they get really close together and they're in the same place at the same time. And then there's a bespoke dental scene where they finally meet each other, and Jack helps her kind of remove the tooth. He defangs her. He defangs the wolf. She realizes it's him she needs, and he realizes he's useful. He knows how to do that. He can take a wrench and take out a tooth. So they finally fill each other's needs and recognize that this is it. This is what they've both been looking for. But the story had to accelerate towards the end because it had to come to a crescendo. Two people are coming like this. They have to come together. They can't just kind of go down and around. It has to do with also rhythm of story, which exists in every story. There's a flow, and the writer knows it. The writer has every writer, I think, has an intrinsic sense of rhythm and language and sentence. And you know when the story is flowing and when it's not. And when it's not, you have to change it.
So when you have to change it, I would love it if you could talk a little bit about finding where to start and just sort of you mentioned something over the summer about writing your first couple of pages and then just completely chopping off the beginning and starting, you know, right at the action, right, starting at the beginning. Could you kind of talk us through how you find that spot
Right.
and how
Yeah.
you know, are able to trim that fat?
Yes, it's kind of like when you're doing your first drafts, you're spinning your wheels a little bit, and you have a lot of information that you want to give to your reader before the main action starts in your characters. I don't know why that's an instinct, but it's definitely an instinct in me. It's like, oh, well, you have to know all this. You really do, because otherwise you won't understand what's going to happen later. I've found that that's not so true. Once you write the whole story, all that background information can actually go away. And your reader is much smarter than you think when you first start a story. All you have to do is give a tiny little hint here and they're with you. And so take all that explanation and background, 37-year-old Aaron Friedman woke up one morning to go to his job as a tax assessor. No, 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 no. No, you start where something's really happening. And I don't think you get to that until you spin your wheels for a while as a writer. And there's a lot of extra stuff that you'll put into a piece. I mean, my stories start out maybe 30 pages long and they go down to 10. And then they go back up to 15 and down to 12. So I'm constantly expanding and contracting and finding where is the life of this story? Where is the movement of this story? And you have to kind of at one point read your words like a reader rather than a writer. So for example, as a writer, I have a beautiful description of a river that is, I think, it's a metaphor. It's gorgeous. It's really capturing something real about the way water moves in this particular forest. And so I have put it in because a woman is traveling, and she comes by a river. I'm like, oh, great, the river description. And in it goes, and it's fantastic, except in the story, and this is where you have to read like a reader, there's a guy following her, and maybe he's got an axe. So, he's got the axe, she's going by, you see the river, and this is not the place for the river description. Your reader will go crazy and start flipping pages. It's like, I don't care how beautiful it is. There's a guy with an axe behind her and she needs to move a little quicker. So that's like what I mean by reading your piece like a reader. You reading it for flow, reading it for, when do I need to know this? Absolutely. Because 9 times out of 10, it isn't right up top. You can work it in later if it's really important. What's really important is that something is happening. Drama, plot happens in scene. Plot happens because characters change. So a character has to be in the process of something when you first see them and not waking up.
That's very true. Reading like a writer is very important because, or writing like a reader, the
Yeah.
reverse is very important because the readers are all we have at the end. It's just
Yeah.
a bunch of words on a page until they bring it to life. So speaking of bringing it to life, I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about humor and horror and how they kind of act as reciprocal forces in all literature, but I think especially in your stories, because you've always got comedy with an edge. And how do you kind of leverage those forces to push the plot along to the best of your ability? I mean, what is your how do you write humor? I think is a good place to start.
Well, humor, I think, has a lot to do with surprise. So that's where I find it. And horror and humor, well, I'll go back to Halloween, but horror and humor are two sides of a Halloween coin. I mean, what's wonderful about that holiday is that it's all kind of, we're all in on the joke. You know, there's a guy chasing you with a chainsaw, maybe if you go to a haunted attraction, but you know the chainsaw doesn't have a chain. It may be spewing gas and steam and all that kind of stuff, or smoke, but it's not real and it's not going to hurt you. And that's the wonderful part of Halloween, is that we all know what it is, and it helps us practice fear in a way. And by the way, if you do ever go to a haunted attraction and you are frightened, this is what I've learned. Do not be in the back, because like hiding behind your friends, because every haunt actor I've ever known will go for the scared one at the back. So if you want to be not bothered there, walk in the middle, be confident. They won't bother you. They won't take the time. But okay, so horror and humor, it's like darkness. You know, but people always say, how can you be looking at Halloween for so long? It's such a dark place. And it's like, I do not think it's dark at all. I think Halloween is the time you put a little light in the darkness. And that's what I find in my stories. It's like, if people see them as dark, I see them as a way to find a little light in that darkness. Yes, my characters have challenges, but there's always a way out. And there's always a way of thinking about it, or changing the way you think about it to lighten it. And I use humor to do that. I use unexpected turns of plots, or people saying unexpected things, surprises. And I use the supernatural sometimes to lighten up something. If it's a heavy subject, and writing it straight out would be just devastating for me and for the reader, I can throw in a supernatural element, change the plane, change the way we look at it, and still get to the same, hopefully, truths that I would have gotten if I had written the story straight. It's coming in at a different angle. Humor is coming in at a different angle. Supernatural is coming in at a different angle. It's a way to talk about, you know, the death of a child or the loss of a parent, without detailing things so realistically. It just lifts it up a little bit.
So I love the angle that you took in particular with Corpse Walks into a Bar. I think that's the best example of both your humor and your horror working together in the same story. Would you be able to talk about the foundation of that story, about its Irish roots, and how it came to be, and then just what your process writing that was like?
Yes. Corpse Walks into a Bar was, the idea came from, and this goes to, where do your ideas come from? They come from all sorts of places. Corpse came from a Irish ballad that was probably popular in the 15th or 16th century, which is called The Corpse and Thomas McGann. And it was about Thomas, a corpse asked Thomas to bury him, and Thomas has to carry this body from cemetery to cemetery. In the Irish ballad, it's about who are your people, and you can only be buried with your people. So it's about immigration and foreigners and the other, and keeping your family close and together. But I love the idea of some poor guy just sitting around, and in comes a corpse and says, listen, you just got to do this for me. So that was the beginning of it. But then it was a process of discovery. So, okay, so there's the premise, and the corpse walks into a bar as a joke. So the main goal of the first few paragraphs of that story is to try to tell the reader that this is actually a serious story. This is not, it's not a joke. And so in the first page, the corpse says some pretty serious things, or he's crying, and Tommy says some pretty serious things that give you the idea that this is a grown-up story. It's not just a fairy tale. And so then I've got a journey. So it's a series, again, of improvisations. I thought using a corpse, carrying a corpse around was a great way to talk about what we carry with us, when and how we put it down. And it was just manifest in this dead guy that allowed for lots of humor and descriptions. And, you know, he's kind of disintegrating on this travel. So there's a lot of things you can put in and play with to keep it lighter. But it's a journey of how do you carry this? Well, what is he carrying? As the story goes on, you find out that Tommy, the main character, is carrying some guilt about his sister who was killed in a car accident. He feels a little responsible for it. He is not, but he feels that way. And so he's carrying guilt. And as you go through the story, he's talking to the corpse, and you can hear him understand more about his sister and how he has to tell her story and how he has to come to terms with who she was and her death and what a good person she was. And because he knew her, he too was a good person. And as you go through and the story takes shape, for me, the best part comes at the very end when you're polishing it. You've got the flow, you've got all the pieces, it's all together, it is breathing. But then in the polishing part, you get to understand what the story is really about. Yes, he's guilty. Yes, he's carrying this guilt around with him, but he's also stuck. And so the stuckness of the character becomes really important and something as a writer you can play with. So you can go back through the story and find images of being stuck and things in the environment that are stuck. And so you're giving the reader this feeling that everything is kind of stuck in this story. And also, it's a journey from stuck to unstuck. So you can put little images of light in different places along this journey, kind of leading the reader through to dawn, where it ends. So there's all sorts of writerly things that I find really exciting that you can do once you have a story in your arms and you can polish it that way. I don't think I write those things to begin with. What I've got is mud. And then it's kind of like shaped mud. And then after a while, revising, and I do revise a lot, I will get to what the story is really about and how I can really say that and tell it in so many different ways so that it all becomes of one piece.
Thank you for that. We're going to go to Nat really quick with a question.
Hi, Nat.
Hi, nice to see you.
Oh,
This is so random, but I kind of wanted to ask, since you did mention that you've written like or directed screenplays before for plays, I'm curious, since you write a lot of horror and Halloween, and that's such a profitable market, not only in literature, but in film, have you ever considered maybe turning one of your short stories or novels into a screenwriting, like a screenplay, I guess you'd call it, and like pitch it as a movie? Like, could you ever see yourself doing that?
you know, I have never thought about doing that. I mean, I've thought about doing that. I have never yet had the time or the opportunity to do that. And what I would love is for somebody else to do that. But yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be great? Don't we all dream of that? It's like having someone else take your story and make it into something else so that you can watch it. I mean, I would love that. And I know Dr. McKetta had one of her book turned into a stage adaptation, and she was able to watch herself as a character on stage. That just must be so much fun to do
Yeah,
that. But
it's like,
no, I haven't thought about doing screenplays.
yeah, because I've read some of your short stories, and especially when I read them, I'm like, gosh, she's so good at visuals. Like, I feel like that's such a strength of yours that I'm curious to see how someone would adapt it. Because in my brain, I'm seeing it a certain way, but I don't know. I feel like your stories would just be great, like easy to adapt. I don't know, maybe. But
Thank
that would be hard.
you.
You could get someone to do it for you and then still reap the benefits. Like that's the goal.
Thank you very much. I do like to spend a lot of time on the physical world in my stories, and so I appreciate that you're picking that up. But I don't know about you, Elle, as writers, but I need to see a place to put a character in it. And so my stories are set in places I have seen and been in. They're not set in places that I don't know. It makes me feel too loose when I'm writing a place I don't know. It's way too nerve-wracking. So I set them in places that I know what it smells like, feels like. I know how strong the wind is. I know how cold the water is. All those details are real, so that when I create the characters, which are not real, they have a place to stand on, and they become much more three-dimensional for me, and I can start to see them really well. And all characters are autobiographical in a way, because it's all coming from you. So it's in your mind. It's all the things you've seen and heard and read and done. But they're these wonderful, I think of them as wonderful Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein's monsters. They're a bit of everything. So, yes, I met the lady on the couch who was going to kill some kid when he got out of jail. And yes, I read the Ballad of Thomas and the Corpse and Thomas and McGann. And yes, I've been a teenager and I've been to middle school, and I remember that it smells like creamed corn. So I can project into that, but I am not the teenager in the story that I wrote. I've been pregnant, but I am not the woman that's pregnant in the story that I wrote. I can put experiences together. We all can put experiences together and make these wonderful composites that then you breathe life into, and they're a whole new character.
Thank you. That was a beautiful answer. Thank you, Nat, for the question. So if there's anyone here or anyone listening who is involved in film production, directing, acting, anything like that, shoot Lesley an email. I would like to switch gears to the literary contests and awards that you have won, and how you keep all of that organized. I mean, do you have a process for selecting which contests you submit to? Do you just kind of, do you have like a spreadsheet? Some people are very organized like that. Do you just keep up to date, get emails to your inbox, or what's your process for finding these contests, and what's your process for choosing which ones to submit to?
Good question. I use Submittable, which is a really sweet piece of software. It's free. It's online. Every story most literary magazines ask you to submit through Submittable. And so you don't do anything. It just goes into your own database and keeps the status of what's going on. That's a really easy way to do it. There are some magazines that do not use Submittable for submissions, and those you just have to. I keep a list of what I've done with that, but I'll say 90% of them are in Submittable, and that'll do that for you. But how do you choose what to submit to? When I was starting out, I came to quickly realize you cannot know everything all at once. You cannot know what magazine is right for you. It just takes time submitting, time figuring it out. But there are some shortcuts. And one is, Poets and Writers. I subscribe to the paper copy of Poets and Writers, and every month when I get a magazine, I circle a couple of contests that I will enter, and I will enter them. It's just a regime, and every once in a while something works, and so that's that. But there are also Duotrope, which I think for $5 a month, it's a subscription service. But what Duotrope does, which is kind of wonderful, is give you the submission acceptance rate for a certain magazine. And so if you've got a story you really love and it's not being taken anywhere, you can look through Duotrope and find a magazine that takes 50% of its submissions or 90% of its submissions. Because the point is to get your piece published. Your point is to get your piece read by somebody else. And so, if you don't get paid $250 or $30 or $20, or it's not in a certain magazine that you've heard about, but it's in publication and people are reading it, that's the goal. So it gives you a wide range of place to submit to. You don't have to submit to the Paris Review and the New Yorker. You can submit to hundreds of magazines. Duotrope breaks it down that way, but another good list that I use is Erica Strauss. What is her? It's ErikaKrouse writer.com, ErikaKrouse She lists 483 literary magazines in tiers, which is not these tiers, but tiers. And she will do, like the top bracket, and then she'll say very, very good. And then there's about 50 more magazines, and then very good, but probably don't pay. And there's 50 more, and then good magazines with readership. So you can see this wide swath of places to submit. And it's a great way to get a sense of the marketplace. And you can choose, a mid-level magazine rather than the New Yorker and get your piece published, or enter a contest that isn't that you just happen to hit the right reader at the right time, which is all that it is. You have a great piece, somebody likes it, somebody doesn't. You got the right person and you've won a contest. So yes, your story has to be ready, and it has to be, of as best you can possibly do at that point in your life. But some of it is luck, and some of it is persistence, and some of it is getting a real sense of the marketplace and what you can do and where your work fits, which is, it takes time, but it's not impossible. And it doesn't mean you have to read every single literary magazine to know which one fits your style.
Thank you.
Also, I just put in a plug for paying it forward. This is something that I learned that I just think it's so valuable, is that you, as a writer, you start to move in the world like you want to be. What would you want to happen to you as a writer? Once your book is published, what would you like to happen to you? And so you start going to author readings. You'd love to have people come to your readings, going to events, leaving reviews on Amazon of books that you love, like being a literary citizen. Maybe there's a book you really, really love, and I have done this a lot, is you reach out to the author and just tell them. It hurts nobody, and I'm sure the author appreciates it, but it makes you part of this whole literary world, rather than just sitting inside doing your submissions all by yourself. Get out, buy the books, subscribe to the magazines if you really like it, go to their events, just anything that you would want to happen to you. Do that for somebody else. And it's a community, really. It really is a community. You make more connections, you get to know more people. You start asking questions at author signings. You start talking to them afterwards and telling them how much you really, really like their book.
Absolutely. It's so important to, develop that sense of community, because it is such a small world. There's so many writers, but it is such a small world. And, who doesn't want to get fan mail? Who doesn't want to,
Yes.
hear, I read this and I loved it. So,
Yeah.
I really like that plug, and I'm glad you put that in. I think one of the last questions that I'm going to ask you is, what was publishing your debut collection of fiction short stories like? And how is that different from all of the other times that you've published, your nonfiction books on Halloween and any other sort of editorial nonfiction that you've published? Like, what was this like? Was it more sensitive to you? Was it kind of more raw, or was it just easier?
It is definitely more personal. And, one of the things that you come to see is that no matter how sophisticated the reader is, when they're reading fiction, what they're actually thinking is, oh my God, did this happen to her? So how could she know this if this didn't happen? How could she know? Has she ever been to Russia? She must have been to Russia. So it feels very personal because you've done it and you've given this to the world, and it's you're very vulnerable in a book of fiction, in a memoir, and in a poem. You're vulnerable putting your stuff out into the world, but you're less vulnerable than your readers think. So oftentimes people will come up to me and they'll say, God, Les, I'm so sorry. It's like, that didn't happen to me. This is fiction. I made this up. I made it up because I wanted to explore this question of teenage cruelty, bullying, or someone who lost a couple of fingers. I just wanted to explore that. I'm okay. So it's interesting that way. And also this first publication, I must say, in kudos and props to HES, which is, I was counting up today, thinking about this, how many hands have touched the stories that are in Unaccustomed to Grace, how many workshops I've been to, and critiques and writers groups and editors. And I came up with 150. There have been 150 pairs of hands on this book in some way or another, And so it's not quite a lonely thing that you're doing. It's very much a community of writers. Yes, it's your work. Yes, you do most of the heavy lifting, but you're not doing it alone. And I mean, if you're in the master's program, you know that you got to take 6, 7, 8 workshops, 12 people in each one. Each one of them has said something about what you wrote. And many of the stories in Unaccustomed to Grace are from workshops at HES. Not all of them, but some of them are. So there's all those hands on it. There's all the writing groups I've been in. There's all the people I asked to read it, like Dr. Maketa. Will you read this? Oh, sure. There's that. And then there's all the editors that you get along the way in the magazines that say halfway down page 8, fix that and you're golden. 150. So you're never alone.
Well, thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your wisdom with us and just being you. I think you're one of the people that I personally look to when I think, am I going to make it as a short story writer? And I think, well, Les is making it. She's been doing it for, however many years. You've been winning awards. You put out your debut book, and I am so excited for you, and I'm so excited for everybody who gets to read these stories, because this is one of the books that actually sits next to my bed, and this is one of my inspiration books, so it's very, very special for my writing process as well. So thank you so much for writing such incredible stories. And if anybody here hasn't, again, I think a lot of you said that you were new to her work, go out and pick up a copy. Unaccustomed to Grace, I'll post another link in the chat. Really, it's worth it. It's an abundance of inspiration and craft and just interesting, weird, fun stuff. It's amazing. So thank you so much for coming today and agreeing to speak with us. Because
my pleasure entirely. And can I say, if anybody wants to reach out or has a question or anything, please feel free to email me.
I can post your email in the chat.
Okay.
All right. Does anybody have any last minute questions before we allow Lesley to go home. I think we had one question earlier that Margaret was asking, how do you judge whether something will be funny to your readers? So we've got another question about humor.
Oh, wow, you really can't know, can you? You know, depending on their age, their frame of reference, the context, you really can't know what other people's humor, funny bone, where it is. All you can do is, and I go to surprise and invention, you know, do something different, wild, crazy, surprise them, play a little bit with the comic elements that you have, what they might look like or sound like. But no, you can never predict what's downright funny.
Yeah, I think that's one of those hit or miss. You know, you could think it's funny, and then you put it on the page and you realize, ooh, that did not land the way I thought it was gonna land. And another question about horror. Huang Chen wants to know why you choose to write horror.
You know, it's funny. I don't think that I do. Um, I wouldn't call my stories horror. I have a great familiarity with horror just from having to study Halloween. I don't watch horror movies. I don't like them. But it's, you know, part of the my professional development. I've had to do a lot of things in that world. But for my own stories, I never think of them as horror, although, you know, you might argue that a corpse is part of the world of horror. But that's one story in 13 others in this collection, and the rest of mine just don't have many horror elements. They can be dark, but dark and light at the same time. And I tell you, there's a love story in there. It's not all horror.
Yeah, I think that's what makes your stories so special is that you've got that balance in every single story. You never quite dip too much into the yin or the yang. It's always that really beautiful balance. Oh, Gwen wants to know, are you concerned with traumatizing your reader? And how do you entertain versus traumatizing? I think that's a really good question.
That is a good question. Um, I I don't write to traumatize, certainly. I write characters and follow them as they face challenges. So I don't write graphics, you know, graphic violence or anything like that, or even graphic sex or anything like that. These are really character-driven stories. So, for example, I have the last story in the collection is about a family that has a young boy who gets very sick, and they need to ask the help of a guru who lives next door. And you know, there are elements in that story. You know, a house gets set on fire. You know, there's some sadness around dealing with this child's illness, but the child is doing okay at the end of the story, and it's a year later, and the family has faced something, and they're together, and they're alive, and they have succeeded in living one day to the next the best they possibly can, facing this thing. So, you know, I hope that's not traumatizing. I hope that it talks about some serious issues, but not in a way that shocks you or in a way that's unearned, like gratuitously. I hope that's never the case. I would be mortified if it was.
So avoiding the shock value and just focusing on
Yeah,
character-driven
right.
story. I think that's
Yeah,
good advice.
real people doing real things.
If there are no other questions, then I think we can close out today's event. Thank you so much again for coming. It's always
Thank
such a pleasure
you.
chatting
Thank
with
you.
you. Thank you so much. We can stop the recording. There we go.